thank you for putting on this speaker series, and thank you to everybody who keeps the BC Archives alive and thriving. It's a fantastic resource. And you've also already covered bits of my talk, but that's fine. There'll be a little bit of a review. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the archives and highlight some of the items in the collection and some of the collections in particular. And I'm happy, as Teresa said, to take questions of clarification as we go along, or more interesting, deeper questions as they occur to you. And anybody who'd like to keep their video on, it's nice to talk to real people, but I've got a few of them on that are kind of the organizers, so if the rest of you want to stay behind the screen, that's fine as well. So I'm going to use a PowerPoint to guide us through this, because that also allows you to see the images as we go along. So I'm calling it History in the Rock, as you know, you're all fans of archives, is that archives are where historians go to get the raw material to write histories from. And of course, very little history of the transgender community has yet been written. We had an acknowledgement. I would also like to make my acknowledgement that we're on the Lekwungen speaking people's territory, which is made up of Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples, who continue to be here with us today, and we thank them for sharing their space with us. Transgender Archives has a huge array of materials in it. This is one of our advertising pieces. I just put it up to give you a little bit of feeling for some of the content, and of course I'll go into that in a lot more detail. So I like to start with the question of why do we need archives, and for the friends of the BC Archives, you probably have many answers yourself. Here are a couple of the answers that I like. One from George Orwell: the most effective way to destroy people is to deny and obliterate their own understanding of their history. Very applicable to trans people, because very few trans people know anything about their own history, because a very core piece of trans history until very recently, and still for many people very recent now, is isolation. And so when you're isolated, you don't know your history, and as I mentioned a moment ago, very little of it has been written about transgender people, non-binary, two-spirit, and other gender diverse people. And then from Confucius: study the past if you would define the future. And certainly trans people are interested in defining a different future than we've seen in the past. And just a note on language, there are many identifiers that people use that could be said to fall underneath an umbrella of trans, or trans plus is what I often say. But not everybody, for instance, who identifies as non-binary or agender would call themselves trans. But for the sake of ease of speaking, I'm going to say trans plus, and I'm going to ask you to understand that the plus includes a lot of people who may or may not think of themselves as trans, or may have some culturally other kind of language to use to describe their gender diversity. And when we look into the past, this is even more the case. So I will sometimes say trans plus, I will sometimes just say gender diverse people so far. But now I want to show you a video.
The Trans Archive has been very much an eye-opener. The Trans Archive is very diverse, and it is such a rich body of work that is available.
Transgender Archive and training in Transgender Studies are a very special place for me. I hope every researcher about transgender have opportunity to come here. I don't have the same opportunity in Japan.
Yeah, the experience has been great. Everyone was really friendly when I was corresponding to get stuff set up for my visit. I'm gonna miss it. I don't want to leave.
We have nothing but curiosity to lead us forward. So first of all, just breathe curiosity.
Okay, thank you for watching that. I'd like you to understand a little bit of the context of what the Transgender Archives is part of. You've probably all been to UVic at some point. This is the UVic Library building. The Mearns Center and the archives are at the bottom floor. And when you go into the archives, go into the library, go downstairs, and you can see on your screen the entrance to the archives reading room and a shot from the interior of the reading room. So you're all invited to come. Unfortunately, right now, UVic is closed. The library is closed, the archives are closed, but they are promising will be open for September. So please come and put your hands on a little bit of trans history there. So what's in the Transgender Archives? Research records that go back to the late 19th century, records of trans activism since 1960, trans activism as self-consciously calling themselves trans. Only started in the beginning of the 20th century. There was a book published by Magnus Hirschfeld in 1910 called transvestites. It's a term that's still used a little bit, but not so much. But then it was a welcome term to people who could identify with it and call themselves something, and there was organizing that took place under the name transvestites for recognition and rights in Berlin and Germany in the 1920s and 30s. You have probably, many of you, if not all of you, seen photographs of Nazi book burnings. And the book burnings were the books from Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute for Sexual Science. Almost like 75–80% of the books in those photographs were from his institute, where first trans people were getting medical treatment and were finding acceptance, and there was a campaign for rights. And you can probably guess that the Nazis closed all of that down. The next time that trans people started to organize as self-consciously trans people was in late 1950s, early 1960s, and so our records date from that time. As you see up on the screen, they're from 23 countries on 6 continents, which is everywhere except Antarctica, 15 languages. There's a list of all the languages, so it's quite diverse. It is mostly English, and it is mostly from North America and Western Europe, but as you can see, there's materials from all over the world, and I've got a few examples up there of some of the content. The photograph with the top hat is from Japan. The one next to it is from England. Directly below is Cuba, as you can see in the title. To the left of that is from Finland. And the little black and white one is historically significant. If you know anything about the history of transsexualism in particular, the first book was written by someone named Harry Benjamin, and this was a meeting, notes from the meeting of the Harry Benjamin Foundation. And you can see the dates underneath there to give you some idea of the range of what we have. So going a little bit further with what's actually in there, when I say it's the largest transgender archives in the world, people generally have a smaller idea, smaller size in mind than what it really is, because a lot of people think, well, how much could there be about transgender people? This is just the tip of the iceberg, and as you know, archivists will say how long is the shelf, if you put it how many linear feet or linear meters, and you can see it's a football field and a half is our estimate of the size of our archives. So it's pretty big. And I've got a list on the screen there of all the different kinds of things that are in there. It's quite extensive. The ephemera is some of my favorite. We've got trophies and buttons and matchbook covers, and and we've got quite a bit of original art as well. I put a few examples of content up on the screen. Impotence in the Mail, 1939, so that's a very intellectual, technical book. The one to the right of it, each one too, is kind of a cheap pocket novel newsprint that has trans themes in it. Sir Transsexual below is a textbook from Spain. To the left of that, FTM stands for Female to Male, is from Japan. It's all in Japanese. I can't tell you too much about what it's about. Next to that is a letter from a very famous organizer in early trans, well, not that early, but 40 years ago, trans rights, by the name of Lou Sullivan. And it's particularly poignant because it is dated the day before he died. So that's for those of us who know who he is. And then one of my favorites to the left, if I was in a classroom, I'd say, does anybody recognize what language that is? I don't know if anybody here will get it, but it's actually in Yiddish. And it's from our clippings files. And it's a Yiddish announcement for the opening of the first quote-unquote sex change clinic in North America. So that gives you an idea of the range and the variety of what's in the collection, but I will continue to give you those ideas. So the major collections that make up the Transgender Archives, and there are many different collections of different sizes, but the big ones that I want to talk about today are Ricky Swin Institute collections, which came from an organization called the Ricky Swin Institute. Collections of Reed Erickson and the Erickson Educational Foundation, which is named after him. I'll tell you more about him. There's a picture there. University of Ulster Transgender Archive was something that was created as a trans archive and was quite large. And when it came to us, it pretty close to doubled the size of what we had. So it was probably, could have been one of the largest in the world in its day, and it's now part of ours. And Ayanna Marical is here, as on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, is a Two-Spirit Indigenous person from parts of Canada, and I'll tell you more about her as we go along. So, Ricky Swin collections. Picture in the upper right corner is Ricky Swin and one of her dogs named Kiddo. And she put together a institute that was meant to be a research institute in Chicago, funded out of her own funds. She did very well in business. And things didn't quite work out the way she had hoped it would. And after a couple of years, it closed down. For a while, she lived in Victoria. And she and I were at lunch in a little cafe in Oak Bay. And I said, Ricky, what happened to your institute? And she said, well, I own the building, I just closed the door. And it was sitting there on the top floor of this building in downtown Chicago. I said, what are you going to do with it? And she said, well, I'm thinking about moving it to Victoria. And I said, would you think about moving it to the University of Victoria? And in the end, she did. Took a couple of years to negotiate everything. And I hadn't asked the permission of the librarian when I said that, but fortunately, she liked me and went for it. And that was the founding collection that started what later became the Transgender Archives. At that time, we did not consider that the Transgender Archives. We just figured we had a collection, a large collection. But as more collections came in, after a while, we did decide that we had a Transgender Archive. So in there's lots of books. There are documents from something called Fantasia Fair. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. There's a lot of material from an individual named Ari or Ariadne Kane, goes by both names. There's some material from an organization that was very big in its day, is now defunct, called the International Foundation for Gender Education. There are some of the materials of Virginia Prince. Her materials are spread out in a few places, as are Ari Kane's, and I'll tell you more about her in a moment. And then there's photos and audio and videotapes, etc. And again, at the bottom of the screen are a couple of examples of some of the materials in there. Queen is from Japan. The one in the middle, FTM International Newsletter out of the United States. And Emergence on the left is a book, which was the first autobiography by a trans man. And so we've got several copies of that, or first editions, etc. I am keeping an eye on the chat if anybody has any questions as we go along. So I said I'd tell you a little bit about Fantasia Fair. You can see a brochure for it up here in the upper right-hand corner. That's from 1980, but it actually goes back much further than that. It is a week-long event, originally for male heterosexual cross-dressers who, when it started, called themselves transvestites. They now mostly call themselves trans or cross-dressers. And it happens for a week. This year, because of the pandemic, is the first time it didn't happen in person. It happened online. 2020 and 2021 remains to be seen what will happen, because it's in October, so we haven't hit October 2021 yet. It's in Provincetown. If anybody knows Provincetown, it has a significant reputation for a long time as being a very gay-friendly place. And so the cross-dressers, and they thought, well, who's going to be willing to accept us? They thought Provincetown would, and Provincetown has embraced them. So I said it's been 1980s, a long time ago, but it goes back quite a bit further. So it is the oldest and longest running event of its kind that anybody's been able to come up with. It started in 1974. It is still going, and I'm sure there will be one this year as well. So that's a long time. It's not big, 100 or so people, maybe 120, and it is a whole week, and it's quite delightful. I've been a couple of times. They've had me in as a speaker. I've done a talk similar to this there as well. Ariadne Kane, who I mentioned a moment ago, is one of the founders of it. And we have records of the Fantasia Fair from its founding to 2001, which came to us by way of Ari Kane. They promised me many times now that we'll see the rest of the records, but at the moment, that's what we have. It's only up to 2001. And that includes all sorts of correspondence and programs and audio tapes and videotapes and newsletters. And there's a lot of fascinating stuff. It's quite a large collection, and it's a really significant piece of history. So I said it started for cross-dressers. It has expanded, and now there's cross-dressers, there's people who do full medical transition, there's people going in all directions, and a few non-binary people. It's mostly a binary event. Maybe I'll just take a moment, because I'm not sure everybody is familiar with binary, non-binary. So in the trans community, we talk about binary, we're talking about people who make an attempt to make and identify themselves as a man or a woman. And non-binary are those folks who mix it up in a variety of ways, or say neither man nor woman applies, or both apply, or sometimes it applies, or half applies, or doesn't apply at all. So the non-binary folks, I haven't seen too much represented of them at Fantasia Fair. I mentioned that we have a lot of records from the International Foundation for Gender Education. This was founded by someone named Marissa Cheryl Lynn, who passed away a couple of years ago. I've got arrows pointing to key people in the photograph in the bottom right, so she's on the left in the vest. And they sponsored large conventions from 1987 to 2010, so that's quite a long time. They were called Coming Together. And they were an important coming together for the community. And then they also published a magazine. I put an example of that up in the upper right-hand corner. That was a glossy, full-size magazine that you could find in its day in magazine racks that had all manner of women's magazines and men's magazines and news magazines and so on. And it was a lifeline for a lot of people who thought they were the only one like them in the world and had no idea how to meet anybody else. And they would see this magazine in among everything else and realize there were other people like them, and there was a large section in the back of personals where you could write to somebody through a mailbox. So you couldn't write to them directly. You would write to a post office box that was run by the IFGE, and then they would connect you up. So there was a certain safety factor, because we're looking at this magazine being published from 1979 to 2009. It's a long time, and let me tell you, even in 2009, it wasn't particularly safe to be out as a trans person on a public news rack. And certainly in 1979, in the 80s and the 90s, it was definitely something you wanted to be very cautious about who knew and what they knew. But that was a very important magazine for the community for, as you can see, quite a long time. Another original board member was Betty Ann Lind, who helped to start the Fantasia Fair as well. I put up her picture, and partly so you can see what she looks like, but also because we have in our collections a beautiful portrait of her, which is much larger than you can imagine from looking at it here. But this lovely portrait is framed in under glass and is part of our collection as well. So she was a board member, as I said, Fantasia Fair and also IFGE. Two other people in the black and white photograph, I mentioned Ariadne Kane, and there's a very small picture there, and I'm going to tell you more about Virginia Prince in a few moments. Okay, so Virginia Prince, I put her dates up at the top, and you can see she had quite a long life, and quite a few of these people I knew personally. I knew Betty Ann Lind, I knew Marissa Cheryl Lynn, Ari Kane is still alive, I know Ari, and I did know Virginia as well. So I put up here, she's a founder of modern transgender activism. It's a pretty big claim, and I'll explain to you why I make that claim. So she accidentally became the public face of cross-dressing in the United States. And when I said our records start with 1960, it's Virginia Prince that I was referring to. So what happened was she put out a newsletter. But prior to that, or around the same time, actually, she put out a magazine. And the U.S. Postal Service probably wanted to get her because of that. But what happened was, she was corresponding with someone else. And by corresponding, I mean, we're talking about 1960-61. I mean, she would take a pen and write on a piece of paper and fold up the piece of paper and put it in an envelope and lick the envelope and write an address on the front and put a stamp on it and mail it to one person. And it was somebody who wanted to receive it, okay? And it was very private. And she was writing to this person who she believed at the time to be a heterosexual, cisgender woman. And it turned out that the other person was also a cross-dresser, which means was someone who was assigned male at birth and was living part-time as a woman, which is what Virginia was doing. And the Postal Service was interested in this other person. And at this time in the United States, there was a law against sending obscene material through the U.S. postal system. And they confiscated their letters and charged both of them, and I know Virginia's story here, charged both of them with a felony offense of sending obscene material through the mail for writing each other personal letters that they were two consenting adults who both wanted to send and receive these letters. They were enjoying it. They wanted to do this. There was something risque in there, I suppose, for 1961, So she got charged, she got convicted. She got tried, she got convicted of sending obscene material through the mail. Now, if you are convicted, you don't want to go to jail. She was a very middle-class person. She had a PhD in pharmacology. She was white. Her dad was a doctor. She had resources, and she used those resources to get herself a good lawyer, and the lawyer got her out on probation, and so she didn't have to spend time in jail. But when you're on probation, if you break any law, you go back to jail, or you go to jail. In her case, she hadn't been to jail yet. She was a cross-dresser. She'd been a cross-dresser since she was like 14 years old or something. And cross-dressing was against the law. So if she was caught cross-dressing, she would go to jail. And try and imagine what would happen to a well-educated white middle-class person who was in a men's prison for cross-dressing. It would be very, very ugly and very, very sad. Her lawyer managed to convince the court that she should be allowed to cross-dress for educational purposes. And the court said yes. She was given permission, and that started her career as a public face of cross-dressing, because she started making public educational speeches to places like the Lions Club and the Rotary Club and church basements. And so she became a speaker, and she did that till she was like 90 years old. She did it for a long time. Now, she's also very important because that was, among the first public speaking on the subject and public advocacy. She's also very important because the word transgender, many people trace it back to her. So in her time, there were really only two words for trans people. There was transvestite, which is a part-time person, a person who generally was assigned male at birth and would dress as a woman on a part-time basis. And there were transsexuals who would do everything medically possible to change themselves from one binary gender to the other. Virginia was neither, and she didn't think you should have to have surgery to be a woman. And so she took hormones, but she was not interested in genital surgery. But she did start living full-time as a woman, and you can see a nice photograph of her when she was young and good-looking. So she started living full-time as a woman without the benefit of genital surgery and without any interest in having genital surgery. She says, there's got to be a word for me. She says, I'm not changing my sex, I'm not a transsexual, and I'm doing more than changing my clothes, I'm not a transvestite. She said, I'm a transgenderist, I'm changing my gender. And that's the word that later evolved into the way we use transgender today. Now, I told you before I knew her, she did not like the way the word is used. She said, they stole my word, it had a very precise meaning, and now they're using it to mean everything. And she didn't like that. But nonetheless, she's one of the sources and the main source for the word transgender that we use today. I said she started a magazine around the same time as she had this conviction for sending obscene material through the mail. That was called Transvestia. I've got two examples of it in the lower right. Started in 1960. It ran till 1986. So the two main publications throughout decades were the Tapestry I showed you before and Transvestia that I'm mentioning now. Both of them are completely digitized and available through the Transgender Archives. We have digitized both of them and made them available through the Transgender Archives online. I put these two copies up here because it's not an accident that they're different sizes. The one on the left was issue number 1, and issue number 1 was 1960. I would take me another hour at least to explain to you how different life was for trans people in 1960, but try and use your imagination about just how shameful and what a sickness it was, and it was against the law, it was, and how, if anybody knew, how completely devastated and destroyed your life would be. So this first issue was made small enough to fit in a breast pocket, right? Because you didn't want anybody to see it. And of course, anybody who received it would receive it through the mail in a brown paper envelope unmarked. And many people even went so far as to purchase a post office box under an assumed name to receive materials like this, and then hid them. So this first one was much smaller than the subsequent ones because they wanted to be able to hide it in their first two, actually, to hide it in their pockets. And of course, we have copies of those as well. The next major collection I'd like to tell you about Thank you. Who just put that up? Jesse put up in the chat where you can see the digitized copies of Transvestia. Thank you, Jesse, for putting that up. I'm watching the chat, but I'm not seeing any questions. So I'll just remind you, I will take questions if you put them in the chat. The next collection I'd like to talk about, individual I'd like to introduce you to, is Reed Erickson. Reed Erickson, somebody that I never met, but I certainly probably know more about him than anyone else, because I've been his biographer for a number of years, so I know really a lot about him, but never actually met him, as I only started to take an interest in him after his death. So he started an organization called the Erickson Educational Foundation, which you can see on the screen. Ran for 20 years, but it was mostly active in the late 60s and through the 70s, not too much in the 80s. And he was very wealthy. He inherited a certain amount of money from his family, who had built it up, and then he made a lot of smart business and land acquisition decisions, and ended up owning oil wells throughout the South. And so they pumped lots of money out for him. And he was a trans man, and he put his money into the Erickson Educational Foundation, which was supported a number of different causes. So the first one was a homophile organization called One Inc. Homophile is a term we don't hear anymore. Love of the same, or love of homosexuals. Now they're called gay rights or something like that. But this was in the 60s. And what we now think of as gay pride really didn't launch big time until after the Stonewall riots in 1969. So he supported this organization. His support of this organization allowed it to survive and evolve in various ways. And today, the offspring, or the progeny of the organization that he supported, is called the One Archives in Los Angeles at the University of Southern California. For those of you who are you're archives people, you may have heard of it. It is the largest LGBTQ archive in the world, and it would not be there if it weren't for his support in the early days of this organization. The main thrust of what he did was about transsexualism, and I'm going to give you a little more detail about that in a moment. Right here, what I'll say is he supported the first 3 international conferences that ever happened. He's not just supported, he made them happen, and they were his baby. The first 3 international conferences that ever happened on transsexualism. And those conferences evolved in this different trajectory, but a similar way that I was trying to describe to you what happened with the homophile organization One Inc. And today, the result of his investment in his initiative to start these conferences is an organization called the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which has membership all over the world and produces standards of care for healthcare for transgender people that are used all over the world. I'm a member, I'm one of the authors of those standards of care, and one of my jobs is overseeing their translation into world languages, and we're at 17 languages now. So this, again, he started something that really evolved into something very, very important. He funded pretty much all the early researchers in the field who went on to become the people who were foundational to research on about trans plus people. And they had a publication series, a film series, did TV and radio shows, and had a speakers bureau. I'll give you a little more detail about each of those in a moment. These 3 conferences, the first one was 1969. So it goes back a long way. So 1969, London, 1971 in Denmark, 1973 in Dubrovnik, which was then Yugoslavia. I guess, sort of. And then he also later in his life got an interest in New Age movements, and one of his things was he liked to give seed money to people or organizations that were going to do well on their own, and he had a really good track record of picking the ones that were in fact going to be successful. So today we take it for granted that cetaceans, dolphins and whales are intelligent and communicate. But that wasn't always the case. And one of the projects that he supported through the Erickson Educational Foundation was a guy named John Lilly, who did that research that convinced the world that those marine mammals can communicate. And again, it really took off. Dream research, which was in its infancy then, and now we take it pretty seriously. And again, I don't know what your connections are. Many people have heard of A Course in Miracles. Many people have not. It claims to be divinely inspired set of books that teach people how to live a better life. It's kind of a religion, and it's been translated into 20-something languages around the world and is very successful. And he paid for the first edition of that. So he had this great track record of figuring out what's going to really make it. Those are his three areas. Because this is a talk about the Trans Archives, I'll focus for a few moments on what he did for trans people. So he collected newspaper clippings. We have a great collection of large binders full of newspaper clippings that start in the 60s and run through till the 80s. It's a fantastic resource, and those newspaper clippings were the basis for his newsletter. So on the left here I have a clipping from 1968 that's from something called the Afro-American Semi-Weekly in Washington, D.C., and it's a story about the person in the picture there is John Paul Simmons, and the story is about him marrying Miss Dawn Pepita Langley Hall, who was a British aristocrat and biographer. So that was one of the clippings, and the one I showed you before about the Yiddish one was also in his clipping files. He put out this newsletter, dates here 67 to 76, and then one issue in 83, which was a really, really valued resource at the time. If you can, for those of you old enough, cast your minds back. For those of you who are a bit younger but know your history, what would it take to find out all the news and all of the research publications that happen, and all the lectures and all the television or radio shows that happened in this period, 1967 to 1976? There's no internet. How do you find out about all those things that are happening and all those research projects? This newsletter brought it all together. They were quarterly. They were a resource that trans people and researchers alike considered invaluable. I still get people today getting in touch with me to say, I've saved my newsletters all these years. Would you like to have them? And they've saved them all these years because they were so important to them. Similarly, they put out a pamphlet series. I've got one of them up here. Put out a pamphlet series. You can read on the screen what the titles were and the dates were. 1971 to 1974. Very wide-ranging. They were the best information you could get. For decades, they were the best information. They were accessible. They were put in accessible language. They were nice production values. Felt good in your hand. They cost nothing. They would say, well, if you could send us a quarter or $1 or something, like 25 cents or $1, that would be nice. But they were free. And again, I have people 50 years later who are saying to me, 45 years later, who are saying to me, I'm still holding on to them. They were so important to me. Do you want them? Right? So there's still some of them around. They were really important. Correspondence, funding applications. I said he funded all these researchers. Court records, newspaper clipping files, personal papers, photos, ephemera. So that gives you an idea of what's in the Reed Erickson collections. This collection is like 50 boxes, 45. I think it's 45 boxes. So there's a lot of material there. Smaller file, but an interesting file. It's local, so I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about this one. Barb Finley has donated to us the records. Barb Finley is recently retired, for decades the best lawyer on LGBTQ issues in the country, and tireless. This is someone you definitely want on your side. So she was great lawyer. I don't think she stopped doing anything, but anyway, so this case, Kimberly, that's Barb Finley on the left, Kimberly Nixon on the right, was quite an important case, and Barb has donated to us her records from the case. So what was the case about? So in August 1995, Kimberly Nixon, who was a trans woman, went to Vancouver Rape Relief, volunteered to be a peer counselor, and entered their training program. In the first meeting of the training program, somebody took her aside and said, well, I can't quote you right now exactly what they said. I have heard Kimberly talk about it, but basically they asked her if she was trans, and she said yes. And so they said to her, we don't want you here. They said to her, you can join our men's auxiliary, but you cannot counsel women who are in distress. Now, bear in mind, Kimberly Nixon had transitioned some years before, was herself the victim of sexual assault and interpersonal violence in her home, and had already volunteered for a number of years successfully as a peer counselor at a different organization in Vancouver, Women Against Violence Against Women. So, she wasn't coming at this out of the blue. She had a track record and experience to recommend her. But they said, no, not only don't we want you to work with us, but you can join the men's auxiliary. So, insult on injury. She filed a human rights complaint. The BC Human Rights Tribunal ruled in her favor and ordered Rape Relief to pay her $7,500, which at the time was the largest settlement that they had ever ordered. Rape Relief was not happy about this. They took the case, they appealed the case to the BC Supreme Court, who set aside the decision of the BC Human Rights Tribunal and said that Vancouver Rape Relief actually had the right to discriminate and organize as women only, and they had the right to decide what they considered women only. So to this day, our human rights legislation does make some exceptions for particular kinds of organizations to membership-only organizations that have a defined membership to do a certain amount of discriminating. Barb Finlay and Kimberly Nixon asked the BC Court of Appeals to overturn the Supreme Court's decision, but they said no. The law is clear, and there's been no violation of the law. Barb Finlay tried to get the Supreme Court to hear the case, but they refused to hear the case. So this was an important case, and it was something that people consider kind of a win and a lose both. So Kimberly Nixon won in the first case, but then on appeal, she didn't win. But the appeal courts did say that it was discrimination, and that she would be considered a woman anywhere else, but that because of this exception written into the BC Human Rights Code, that Rape Relief had the right to discriminate in this instance. So there was a certain amount of progress made, but it's an important case in the history of BC and the history of Canada on trans rights, and so we have all of our Finley's records on that. So another big collection that I mentioned earlier was University of Ulster, Northern Ireland, Transgender Archives. Big, and you can see it's transgender is spelled funny because it's old. This one is before the word transgender got really established in the English language. So this is 100 linear feet or 30 meters, so it's a lot of material. The books go back over 120 years. So you can see up on the screen a few examples of some of the books. Psychopathia Sexualis from von Krafft-Ebing from 1893. Edward Carpenter, 1909, Intermediate Sex, which was sort of about gay, sort of about trans. As I recall, the word transvestite didn't really come around until 1910. In 1911, interesting book about someone called Chevalier d'Eon, who was a very famous figure in trans plus history. Gilbert had two books, one Women in Men's Guides and one Men in Women's Guides, and that's from 1932. And then Roberta Cowell, autobiography, a famous figure from the UK. So there's lots of EU history, lots of UK history. Newspaper clipping files, interestingly, go back to the 1920s. So you might ask yourself, what are they saying in the 1920s? People clipped out files about people got arrested for cross-dressing, because that was something that was like them, and they've saved it. Now 100 years later, we still have it. So just finishing up, this collection was collected and donated by Richard Eakins, who started in the 1970s. He joined it with another organization that I think had an unfortunate name called SHAFT, Self-Help Association for Transsexuals. 350 periodicals. These are examples of some of the periodicals. And then there's correspondence, personal papers, pulp fiction, some of my favorite photos along the bottom here. The one on the far left is Tula, who was a very famous fashion model, also known as Carolyn Cossie, and it's signed, autographed by her. And the other individuals, they all have stories. And over on the right, from the ephemera, bisexual, transsexual, man-eating, lipstick, lesbian, leather dyke from hell. Now that's a button. I don't know who would wear that in public, but there you go. All right. The last one I want to show you and just spend a minute on is Ayanna Marical. As you can see, she died too young in 2016.
Wait, sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you again. We had a question about
Good.
Ulster archive. Kelly
Good
asks,
question.
why did Ulster decide to transfer its records to UVic?
Okay, let's go back up to Ulster while I answer that. Great question, thank you. Richard Eakins, who I said donated it to us, was a professor at the Richard Eakins was a professor at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland, and he owned this collection. He had never given it to the University of Ulster. He had only housed it at the University of Ulster. And then he retired. And when he retired, the university said to him, we don't want to hold your collection anymore unless you want to give it to us. And he didn't want to give it to them. And so he removed it from the University of Ulster and he put it in a bunch of climate-controlled, or maybe one or two climate-controlled trailers on his sheep farm near the university. And after a while, he said, you know, I'm retired. I don't want to keep taking care of this. And so he offered it to the London School of Economics that have an LGBTQ archive called the Hall Carpenter Archive. Some of you may have heard of it. London School of Economics said, well, that's very interesting. Yeah, we might want to have that. So what we need from you is an inventory of what you have, and then we'll decide what we want and what we don't want. And he basically said, you got to be kidding. He says, I'm retired. I don't have an inventory. I'm not going to spend weeks, if not months, making an inventory and then have you break up my collection. So no, you don't get it. I mean, I'm not quoting him obviously, but that was the gist of what happened. And he and I had known each other for decades because he'd been a researcher in the field for decades, as had I, and he had heard about the Transgender Archives here, and he called me up and he emailed me and said, do you want it? And I said, yes, sight unseen, no questions asked. And then after I said yes, I started asking everybody I knew who were researchers who'd been around for a while. I said, you know Richard's archive? And they go, yeah. And I said, do you know, have you ever seen it? Every single one of them said no. I said, do you know what's in it? They said no. And so one day, months later, it took months to get here. We didn't pay for the fast shipping. We paid for slow shipping. Months later, it arrived at the airport, is where we had to clear customs out at the Victoria Airport. And myself and Laura Wilson, the archivist, went out there to sign the papers, and we had no idea what we were signing for. And so when it got back to the archives and we started opening boxes, we decided it was a good thing we didn't know what we were signing for, because there was some very risque material in there. And kind of customs might have had a good time with us had they bothered to open the boxes. But it said on it it was coming from a university, it was going to a university, it said it was research material, and so we got through customs with no problem, and it was a treasure trove. I was so happy that I said yes, sight unseen, but I had no idea what we were getting. I knew Richard, I knew he was a good guy, so that's how that happened. Okay, I'm just keeping an eye on the time, and I feel like I should be finishing up. As you can see, I've got lots more stories I could tell you about all of this, but I'm trying to stay within a reasonably close to our time frame. So the last collection that I want to highlight, and as I said before, these are not all of our collections by any means, is Ayanna Marical. She lived 1950 to 2016, and she's, as I said earlier when I introduced her at the beginning, a two-spirit woman, and she's from the Six Nations of the Grand River in what we call Ontario. And she was an artist. She described herself as a maker and keeper of culture and a multidisciplinary artist. And she did a lot of performance art as well as writing and visual arts. And you can see in the smaller image a cape that she wore, that she made and wore in one of her performance presentations. She was also a scholar and educator and story crafter and storyteller in the tradition of the First Nations. She was active in the 1990s through the 2010s, and her message, when I say she was a scholar and educator, she taught a decolonizing or decolonized understanding of gender and sexuality, reaching back into her traditions through into the traditions of today. And she did call herself a transsexual woman as well. I asked her to speak at Moving Trans History Forward 2016 as part of our elders panel, and very sadly, she was too ill at that point to come, even with an attendant. She couldn't make the trip, and she died just a few weeks later of cancer and bequeathed her archives to the Transgender Archives. So we're very pleased to have her collection. There's a lot of fascinating stuff in there, interesting things to read, and lots of interesting objects like animal bones and bits of fur and so on that she used in some of her performance pieces or her artwork. So this collection is has not been digitized, but it gets a lot of interest from visitors, and there's some really fascinating stuff in there. And then I wanted to bring your attention to our discovery tool. This is something that we have created and is an ongoing work that we're doing. And so we have hundreds and hundreds of newsletter titles and publications. And so we are cataloging every single article, every ad for an event that appears in all of these. So I mentioned before, Tapestry had, I think it was 117 issues, and Transvestia had 111 issues, and we have gone through every page of them. FTM International Newsletter I put up on the screen at one point. We're just about finished going through every page of them. So we've looked at 92 publications. The ones I've just mentioned, we've done the complete publication, and many of the other publications, we've done a sampling of them. And that accounts for 749 journal issues, and we've got some interns working on it starting in 3 or 4 weeks from now, so that these numbers will be going up again by the end of the summer. That accounts for over 5,000 articles and over 900 events. So in the discovery tool, you can punch in a search word, a location, a person's name, a keyword, and it will show you all the articles that have that topic or that person or that location. You can search in a number of different ways, and if it has been digitized, there will be a link to where the publication is digitized as well. It may be something we've digitized, it may be something that someone else has digitized, and there's a lovely resource called the Digital Transgender Archives, which does not hold any content of its own, but it's a hub that points to all the places where things are digitized. So if it's digitized anywhere, we'll point to it on the Digital Transgender Archives. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It continues to grow at all times. And then I encourage you to follow us on social media. We've got, as you can see, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and lots of YouTube videos, great YouTube videos. And of course we have web pages for everything that we do. And not to compete too much with the BC Archives, but we could always use donations if you have some spare cash. Okay, pretty close to, I think, where I'm supposed to be in terms of our schedule. I've got the thumbs up from Jesse, thank you. And let's see if we got any more questions.
While people are thinking of their questions, just a virtual round of applause for Dr. Erin Devor.
Thank you.
There were rounds of, great applause from all of us here. Your presentation, I don't even know where to start. There was so much in there that some fantastic stories. I was particularly taken with the reminder that archives is more than textual records. Also things like buttons you had there. I love those.
T-shirts, we've got a bunch of T-shirts, and we've got all sorts of stuff.
Great, I know, because we often think archives are textual. They're not only that, right? There's more to it than that. So that's fantastic. I was really pleased to see that Susan Stryker was there. I've read their work, and that was amazing for me personally. To see also too the forethought that you had with the Ricky Swin collection, and just kind of bringing that in, which really kind of started everything, was a wonderful story too. So thank you so much, Dr. Devor. We're going to do a question and answer period now. So you can pop your questions into the chat, and I'm going to hand it over to Thomas O'Donnell, who is my colleague, and he is going to be managing this today. So Thomas, over to you.
I see questions are coming in.
I'll start with a comment from Isabel. They said, "Thank you so much. This was amazing. I didn't know about these archives until I heard about this presentation." And then they just thank you again. So our first question is, I wonder if there are any particular research projects that have come out of the Transgender Archives that really stand out to you?
That's a good question. You know, we get people coming in doing all manner of research that surprises me sometimes of what they show up to talk about. So, you know, of course I expect people to come in and want to talk about the history of activism. I also expect people to come in and want to study about the history of the healthcare and the medicalization of trans people. So we see that. Surprisingly, we've had a couple of people come in who are writing children's books and want to understand the social environment of the parents or the grandparents of these children. And so they want to get a little historical sense from that. Cyrus Marcus Ware came in to, he does beautiful drawings, and he came in to find images of trans people of color to draw their images. So that was one of my favorites. We had somebody else come in who was doing a history of fashion and wanted to see what they could find out about how people's attitudes about how they dress themselves changed. So there's been a whole wide range. Somebody else was interested in the New Age part of what Reed Erickson was doing, and about his fascination with the occult and with the world that you can't see. So wide range of interests, and you know, hard for me to say what my favorite is, but those are some of the ones that caught my interest for sure.
Muted myself. Sort of in the same vein, Zoe asks, do you have a favorite piece of material or source in the archive?
One of my favorites, which I did not include in the slides today, but I do include sometimes, there is a book. I mentioned Harry Benjamin, and he wrote the first book on transsexualism that really turned the tide on not just public opinion, but medical opinion about whether or not transsexual people should get the kind of medical treatment that we now take for granted. So at the time that his book came out, which was 1966, the general medical opinion was that anybody who asked for a medical transition was delusional and insane, and that it would be malpractice for any physician to assist them. And Harry Benjamin wrote this book that said, no, actually, all efforts at psychological or psychiatric treatment have failed, and the only humane thing to do is to let people live in the gender that they feel themselves to be, and to assist them to do that, because then they can actually have a life and be productive members of society. So that book was really transformative, and that book had a series of illustrations in it that were photographs. And for the most part, you know, this was a period of time where people didn't want their faces to show, but some people were willing to let their faces show. And one of my favorite items in the Transgender Archives is that we have a file that has in it the original negatives, the original photographs with the overlays, overlays being a kind of light paper that you can see through where you mark, okay, crop it here and print it in the book at 67%. So we have those photographs that have the overlays on them that are going into the book. We have the original negatives and we have the consent forms. And it's the only set anywhere in the world that exists of those historical photographs for that historically significant book. Now, there was, in addition, at the back of the book, there was a little note that said, if you are a physician and you write to us on your physician's letterhead, we will also send you a series of black and white prints of the results of genital surgery. They didn't publish those. Those you had to ask for, and you had to be a doctor. And of course, we also have a set of those. So nowhere else has these. These are the originals. These are the only ones, and they're in our collection, and that's one of my very favorites.
Those sound very cool, very interesting.
And
Clara
if I may add, and if you come to the archives, you can open that file folder and touch those.
Clara says, thank you so much. Fascinating and interesting. Do you know any trans archives in Germany?
Oh, sure. So I mentioned Magnus Hirschfeld as we were going along, and that his institute was destroyed. But there is a Magnus Hirschfeld archive in Berlin, and there's not all that much left. The Magnus Hirschfeld archive is much smaller than ours, but it does exist, and material occasionally pops up. And one of the most recent and wonderful stories about Magnus Hirschfeld's materials are that he had a boyfriend. Now, he did not die from the Nazis because he was out of the country when the Nazis raided his institute, and so he never came back to Germany. He continued on around the world, and he did an around the world lecture tour, and in Hong Kong he met a young man who he had a lengthy affair with, lived with him for a while, and as things happen, that young man got older, and he ended his life in Vancouver. And the people who acquired his residence, I don't know the details of how this happened, but some people found a suitcase that had belonged to him, and in the suitcase were a number of things of Magnus Hirschfeld's, including a death mask. If you know what a death mask is, plaster of Paris put over a person's face after they die, and you have a shell that comes off that shows what their features were. These were in a suitcase that were found in Vancouver, and the people who found it put an ad up on the early internet. So we're talking about, like the 90s, maybe 2000, I don't even think it was that late, that said, does anyone know a Mr. Hirschfeld? We have some of his possessions. And some friends of mine who run this archive, and another friend, heard about this little note that appeared on the internet, and they tracked it down, and it was quite expensive to buy this suitcase, but that was one of the more recent acquisitions of this Magnus Hirschfeld archive in Berlin, which was a fabulous acquisition that nobody expected to be seeing something like that in this time frame, and it came from Vancouver. So that's one. And then there's another archive in Berlin called the Lily Elbe Archive, which is run by someone named Nikki Trautwein, and it's small but dense and wonderful. It's like a room or two in her apartment, and she's got some wonderful things in there. Unlike Canada, the EU will actually give money to archives to purchase items. Everything in our archive is donated, with the exception of about this much material that we did actually buy. But the rest of the football field and a half is all donated. We pay for shipping, but we don't pay for the contents. But this Lily Elbe archive, she gets money from the government to go out and buy things. So she's got all sorts of interesting stuff there. So those are two that I know of in Berlin, in Germany.
So Melanie asks, when did the Transgender Archives start?
Right. So it was officially launched at one of the conferences of the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, which took place in Atlanta, right across the street from the Center for Disease Control, which is a very famous place in today's world. It was at, what's the name of the university? Emory, I think it is. So that was in the fall of 2011. That was the official launch. the first collection, as I mentioned before, was Ricky Swin collection that we started collecting in 2007-ish, but we didn't think of it as a Transgender Archives then. So it was later when we started to get into, the Reed Erickson collection came in next, and we got a couple of others that were smaller that I haven't mentioned. And then we thought, oh, you know what, I think we have a Transgender Archives. So fall 2011 is the official start of it.
Maria asks, does the archive work/connect with many contemporary trans artists to be able to collect records of their art creations?
Good question, Maria. We are really focused more on the past than on contemporary. And so we do have some contemporary content, but it's usually books that are recently written that are in the circulating collection. So strictly that's not archives. It's kind of sort of a library and archives, if I include that, which I do when I say how much trans material do we have. It's not all strictly archival, rare, one-of-a-kind materials, but there are some newer things that are coming out that are still rare. But we don't have an acquisitions budget, and so pretty much any artist I've ever talked to expects to get paid for their work, and that's fair, they should. And we're not focused on art, so the answer would mostly be no to that question.
Kelly asks, what might the earliest record be relating to trans history in BC at the archives, if you happen to know?
Relating to BC, I think probably the earliest we have relating to BC is from Stephanie Castle. We have a Stephanie Castle collection. Stephanie was someone I knew. She's now passed away. And I'm just trying to look. That would be like the early 90s, I think is probably the earliest thing we have from BC. There may be something else that I'm not thinking of. But she was one of the people that started an organization called Zenith. Some people call it Zenith. She called it Zenith. That was a trans rights advocacy organization, mostly transsexual, some cross-dressers, and very much, she was very binary, she was very binary oriented, and she advocated with government, with healthcare. She's written several books, so we have books from her, we have some organizational records. And if you go to our YouTube channel and go to the first Moving Trans History Forward conference and the first Elders panel, you can see and hear Stephanie, because she was on that panel. And I think that's probably our earliest BC records.
So we have a question that is almost identical to the question I had prepared. So given the change in historical terminology / identifiers, how do you approach archival descriptions to make items and collections accessible to researchers today? Is there a set of best practices?
Yeah, no, that's a really big question, and it's a really big question because archivists have certain conventions. There's Library of Congress and so on, and so those conventions are not sensitive to the reality of trans people. There is a movement, there is efforts being made to get them to be more sensitive and to change them. There's also something called the homosaurus, which is increasingly in use, and the homo for gay, and is trying to expand on the descriptors that we use. So that's one level in terms of the archives and how do you catalog things and how do you search for things and how do you find things. Our discovery tool, of course, is using language that we choose to use, but that's just local. That's not connected up to all the other systems around the world. In terms of trying to understand different times and places, there's a lot of debates about can you use the word trans at all before it became part of the vocabulary. So, the earliest I said was 1910, transvestite, and then we got Virginia Prince said transgenderist, and then, a little bit later it became transgender. Transsexual came into the vocabulary at a certain point. But what about all the people before that? And that's where I would use gender diverse. But I think that there are people whose stories you can look at and you can say, I believe, and all you can say is, I believe, you don't know what they believed, that had that person had our vocabulary available to them, this is what I think they would have chosen, because it fits the pattern of people who choose that today. So an interesting aside, if anybody has ever heard of the book The Well of Loneliness, it came out in around 1920, I can't remember the exact date right now, and it was for decades and decades considered the epitome of the lesbian novel. And for many people it was the only lesbian novel they'd ever heard of or ever seen. And it formed in the public's mind the idea that lesbians were women who wanted to be men. And then around 2000 or so, trans men started saying, wait a minute, if you look at the protagonist in this book and look at the pattern, and yeah, sure enough, this is someone who was assigned female at birth and wanted to be a man and took on a man's name and wore men's clothing and acted as much like a man as they possibly could at a time where there was no option to call yourself transsexual. There was no option to have transsexual surgery. The idea of trans man was, never conceived of yet. And so trans men started to say, that's not a lesbian book at all. That's a trans book. And so that's just an example of the kind of, well, how do you decide? What do you do with historical materials? I think the safest thing to do is to say, well, gender diverse, and if we know what they were assigned at birth, great. And if we know how they lived their life, we can describe that. But it's a minefield. And whatever we describe and decide today, I guarantee you in 10 years somebody will say, how could you have said that? That's so wrong. Because it's a rapidly moving field.
So I believe that is all for questions for now. I'd just like to say I've had the pleasure of going to the archive in person. I went in 2019, and I've also attended some of the presentations that you've given online. And I think, especially in this time of we're all staying at home to stay safe, I think a lot of us feel isolated from our various communities. That can be our archive communities, that can be our queer and trans communities. So I just want to thank you so much for everything about the Trans Archive.
Well, and I want to thank you for putting this on and giving me the opportunity to talk about the Trans Archives. As you can see, it's something that I'm excited about still after all these years. And thank you for the work you do in preserving the BC archives.